Good evening all and welcome. Tonight we are going to be heading to the woods, for some rather inexplicable things are happening down there that I require your assistance to investigate. So get comfortable, grab a flashlight, and let the darkness take control. I had moved to the Hudson Valley region in upstate New York when I was 12 with my mother and stepfather. My mom had many paranormal experiences before this point, but I didn't know of them yet. I myself had never experienced anything that I can remember before moving into our townhouse apartment. I don't know if there's any order to these memories, because they all blur together, but I digress. The first thing that comes to mind is how terrified I was of the woods behind the apartment complex. It wasn't a massive forest by any means, but it was a good half-mile of dense trees. Unfortunately, the garbage disposal, the recycling bin, and the laundromat were all beside said woods, and even in the daytime, you couldn't see much behind the initial line of trees. Oftentimes I would be the one to take the garbage and recycling out, or I was the one doing the laundry, and since I had school and after-school activities, I would be doing these chores at night. I would always run full speed to either the shack that held the bins or the laundromat, to do the chore that needed doing when safely inside, and then run back to my townhouse as soon as I was done. The reason that I would do this is that I would always feel something watching me from the woods, as if I were a frightened rabbit that could sense a hungry fox nearby. Whenever I was alone next to those woods at night, I felt like prey. This leads me to my first experience. I was playing soccer with my cousin. As it was getting dark, our family inside the house started chatting, and no neighbors were in sight. My cousin kicked the ball a little too hard, and it landed only a few feet from the tree line. Not thinking much about it, I rushed over to grab it. When I went down to pick it up though, I saw legs of a shadowy figure standing in front of me. I stood up quickly, too scared to take a good look at whatever it was. I ran over to my cousin and told him what happened. As soon as I turned to point it out though, whatever it was gone. This next experience is probably the one that still haunts me the most. There was a walking path behind the apartment that led to the road on the other side of the woods, and about halfway down the path there was an abandoned house with a small overgrown field of what I think was wheat besides it. The woods surrounding the area on all sides. A neighborhood kid and I decided to walk the path before it got dark, and we passed by the house without really looking at it. As we were heading back, my neighbor stopped in his tracks and smacked my arm to get my attention, saying, "What is that?" I followed his gaze to find a tall figure standing in the field, well above the stalks, which had to have been at least 5 feet high. The thing had the body of a man, but from its head came these long antlers. I froze for a moment, staring at disbelief, when the neighbor's kid grabbed my arm and yelled, "Run." We booked it home, and after parting ways that evening, never spoke of the incident again. The last story is actually my mum's. It was late, probably around midnight, and everyone in the house but my mum was asleep upstairs. She couldn't go to bed, so she stayed up watching TV until she felt tired. In the middle of the show, she heard what sounded like a small kitten meowing outside the living room window. She ignored it and the noise stopped, so she continued her show. Once again, she heard the sound of a kitten crying, so she paused the TV and went outside. She looked everywhere, but she couldn't find anything. Before going back inside though, she heard the sound again, this time underneath our family car in the parking lot, a good 10 feet away from the original sound. She walked up to the car and looked underneath it, as well as under the surrounding cars, but again she found nothing. Feeling like she was losing her mind, she turned to go back inside when she heard the meowing again. But this time it was coming from the tree line, which was nearly 20 feet from the car. She told me she felt a shiver run down her spine as she realized the meowing sounded like it was on a loop. Feeling as though something was trying to lure her into the woods, she turned on her heels and ran back to the house, locking the deadbolt on the door as soon as she got inside. She and I have had discussions about these experiences a lot, and she wonders if it was a kind of cryptid, or perhaps even a wendigo. On the farm-riddled outskirts of a small town called Peru, Indiana, Miami County, lies a state forest called the Francis Slocum State Forest. Before I begin, let me give you a layout of the place so you have a better idea of how eerie it is. Sadly, I have been unable to share any photos as of yet. It's also been too dark every time I venture out with my mediocre iPhone 8. This place is massive, located smack dab in the middle of miles and miles of cornfields, as well as some abandoned homes scattered here and there. It's about a mile-long drive through the forest, and the trees begin winding into one another the further you go. There really is no marker to let you know if you're even in the right place, or not until you're pretty deep into the trees. There are 2 concrete stone markers that I use as my go-to object so I can remember where to turn. Eventually you can no longer see the sky due to the intertwining branches once you get closer to the car park, aka the Devil's Circle. The Devil's Circle is located in the center of the forest, and earned its name because it's a large circle where nothing grows. Once you reach the circle, trails branch out in every direction imaginable. This is where most people park their cars, as it's easy to get a quick getaway if need be. However, I've seen plenty of people park right on the side of the trail as well. This is the backstory I've gathered based on my own research. This place used to be happily inhabited by the Miami Indian tribe for many years, and were buried underneath the land. Eventually they were forced to leave their home of many years, I can't remember when, but the bodies were removed so the Mississinawa Reservoir could be constructed. Naturally this angered the spirits of those buried beneath the land, and fast forward to 2018, there were small parties being thrown in the woods. A drug deal goes bad and a group of 2 boys and 1 girl end the life of a 21-year-old dude called Drake, and left his body to be found later on. The above 2 statements I know to be facts. It is also rumoured by the reservoir staff that around 8 bodies have been found on the land over the years. I've explored the forest twice now, but gone a total of about 5 times. I was too scared to get out of my car the other 3 times because honestly it's terrifying in that pitch black forest, even with flashlights on. The only sound you can hear are the bugs and the water. There are so many trees that it seems as though I was constantly seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye. I also got many strange feelings, such as being followed and that our presence was unwanted. It is said that if you whistle something, it's supposed to whistle back. I tried but got no response. However, the last time I went, another group of people were there ghost hunting as well. They had an EVP box and told us that it was going off like crazy. I told them, as soon as our 2 groups began hollering back and forth in the woods, that was before we knew about one another, that there was an enemy in concentrate. Among other things they did not disclose. Other people from various websites, as I scoured the web hard on this one, said they had some pretty weird experiences. Some state that a black figure had followed their car and chased them out the woods. Others say that they heard voices and sticks cracking as if someone were walking behind them. Another person said that while they were in the forest, they saw different coloured orbs that started flying around the entire forest. They said that they felt as though they projected a good energy. Some felt friendly, shy, eerie, others negative and mean. Personally, I haven't stayed in the forest long enough to have experienced anything here just yet, but I am definitely a believer, and the backstory to this place is just incredible. I would definitely be purchasing some equipment before I make the return trip. What do you guys think could be in there? This has been bugging me for a few years now. About 3 years ago, my girlfriend at the time and myself took a 2-week-long trip to Japan. The original plan was to visit her grandmother, the survivor of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, her dad's family, and take a much-needed vacation from a job that could really care less about me. Her father, who had moved to the US in his teens, had always asked about my family history. As a 4th-generation Japanese American with no remaining family in the 1st or 2nd generation, most of my family's history had been lost with the deceased. I would ask my father and his cousins about where our family was from and if we had any relatives back in Japan, but all the answers I got were vague at best. I get answers like, your great-grandfather and eldest grand-uncle went back to Japan to help rebuild after the war, and that it was thought that we were from the Hiroshima area. No one in my remaining family sought to keep in contact with those who returned, so my ex's father would spend his free time doing research and sharing information he could dig up about my family. He found out that my family originated in the Wakamaya, a city just south of Kobe or Osaka area, and what the kanji for my last name looks like. Unfortunately, before we could make the trip, my ex's grandmother had passed away after a long fight with cancer. Eventually, the time came for us to spend some time in Japan, touring everywhere from Osaka to Tokyo, all the way to Yamaguchi and Hiroshima. We spent most of our vacation bouncing from hotel to hotel in major cities, sightseeing in places like the Tokyo Skytree and the deer that bow in Nara. Being the nerd that I am, I forced us to make a stop to see the Unicorn Gundam and Akibahara that my ex had little to no interest in, but are totally worth it in my opinion. Our trip finished off with a long Shinkansen to Hiroshima, where we would spend an early morning seeing some of the buildings still standing after the atomic bomb and the World War II museum. After that, we would take a trip into the rural areas outside the city to stay at her grandparents' home, where we would meet her uncles and their families who took care of us for the rest of the trip. Her uncle picked us up from the end of the line, which both the train and the station were pretty run down, and took us by car a few more hours to my ex's grandparents' home. By the time we arrived, we were able to unpack and get situated with some daylight left to kill before we would get dinner. Now, if you've never been to rural Japan, go. It's awesome, as the homes there look something straight out of old samurai movies, or are uninhabited, and appear to belong in horror movies. So I suggested we walk around a bit to stretch our legs, as we'd been travelling for most of the day. She agreed, and we began walking down the narrow country roads. As we were walking, occasionally jumping across deep gutters to allow cars to pass, she tells me about an old shrine that sits atop a hill on the edge of the forest that she had visited with her grandparents years ago. Before I get into any details, I feel it's important to mention that my ex is extremely superstitious, and I am not. I also consider myself to be fairly perceptive, some may say paranoid, compared to her. Habitually, I notice things that are out of place, or, for lack of a better term, feel when something is off. Mostly these things come into play when I'm outside and I can spot hidden animals or edible plants back home. That being said, I don't go looking for trouble in the realm of stuff I can't explain. But I figure exploring should be fun. It's still light, I'm in a rural town that I'll probably never get to see again, and I've always craved adventuring, thinking it'll be like the beginning of a video game. So about 20 minutes into our little exploration, we come to a large, unpainted and rotten tori. Those large orange Japanese gateways I'm sure you've seen, and maybe a couple of hundred stairs leading uphill to a forest where the shrine is located. Starting up the stairs, something felt off, but I figured it was just the nervous excitement of exploring. I have a fairly athletic build, but my ex was a bit on the chubby side, so as we were making the climb, she told me she needed a break, but to go ahead as she could tell I was excited. Double checking to make sure she was okay with me going on without her, I continued to race up the stairway. Once I reached the top, the sun had begun to set, painting the clearing on the top of the hill in beautiful orange hues. There were a couple of decrepit buildings atop the hill, the shrine which had been locked up, the path cleared of fallen leaves, which seemed to be out of place that led deeper into the forest. And this is where things started to feel wrong. The first thing I noticed was that at some point it became eerily quiet. No birds, cicadas, not even the breeze rustling the branches in the forest. I cautiously walked around, looking between the boards that made up the walls of the shrine, trying to best wait for my ex to catch up. That's when I heard it. If it hadn't been so quiet, I probably wouldn't have noticed, but on the other side of the hill, across from the stairs, a quick rustle of dead leaves on the ground behind the shrine, I quickly focused my attention in that direction, and peeked around the corner of the shrine. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement calling out, "Hello?" I made my way over to the back of the shrine and looked down the hill, hoping it wasn't a person who slipped and fell, but there was nothing. I scanned the small valley calling out, "Hello, anyone there?" In hindsight, probably should have called out in Japanese. The forest remained still though, and after a few moments I relaxed, thinking a branch had fallen and I was just being paranoid. Then off to the left, where I was looking, there were more leaves rustling, and I caught another glimpse of it. It was big, maybe 5 to 6 feet long, pure white and ungodly fast. There was no way I could have missed something that large or white when I was looking down the valley. It seemed to just appear out of nowhere. Quickly, it bolted behind a small bush and tree growing next to one another, and again there was only silence. Without breaking eye contact, I called my ex, hoping she was close to the top of the stairs and could verify what I saw. Nothing. I called for her again. Still nothing. So I waited, my gaze fixated on the bush and tree that, whatever this thing was, slid behind. I debated whether I should throw something towards it, but was too unfamiliar with Japan's wildlife to feel safe enough to do so, as I didn't want to annoy something that I could never take on in a fight. Waiting for my ex to peek over the staircase, I was fixated on the bush, hoping I could identify whatever this thing was. As my nerves calmed, I came to realize that something large and white couldn't completely hide in a bush that small. Feeling really uncomfortable, I slowly backed away from the edge of the hill and went to find my ex. She was about 20 steps from the top when I told her we needed to leave and that I had seen something. The look she gave me was one of doubt, and she went behind the shrine and looked but saw nothing. She continued to look around for a few minutes. When she said we could leave, we made our way back down. As we descended the hill, I could feel something watching us, stalking us. We made our way back through the town, down the narrow hill, the dimly lit roads, and I'd occasionally look behind us into the surrounding areas, hoping that it wasn't some predator preparing an attack. After returning to her grandparents' house, we ate dinner with her family and went to bed. That whole night I couldn't sleep. I could feel something watching us, a feeling that I carried with me until we left the town. After returning home, I began trying to look up animals in Japan that fit the description of what I saw. When I realized there was pretty much nothing that matched it, or what I could find, I started investigating more paranormal entities. Still, I couldn't find anything. If anyone knows what this thing may have been, I'd appreciate it. It's been haunting me for 3 years and made me nervous about exploring, which I would like to be comfortable enough to do again at some point. I live in a densely wooded forest area of Connecticut. My entire neighborhood's land was once owned by the mental institution in town. When we first moved into this new house, I remember feeling an uneasiness settle into me when I first looked out the window into the trees across my house. Nothing had ever happened at this point. There's a sort of shadowy opening/hole clearing right across from my driveway, but there's no path to it that I can see. For about a month after moving in, I decided to go up for a walk up our streets. Our neighbors are pretty scattered and not too close, and there was no one else out and about at that time. And on my way back, as I was starting to go up my driveway, I hear my birth name being called to me from a small clearing, so I turn and looked at the trees. I heard the sound of my mum's voice, but again she repeated my birth name. It's Turkish and hard to pronounce, so I had it changed when I was 19. This time she was begging for help. I was confused because my mum wasn't home at the time. She had gone to the hardware store, and as I turned to check to see if her car was anywhere in sight, I heard her voice scream my name again, crying this time, asking for me to come help her. And this is when I booked it across the street. It truly felt as if my mum was in there. She sounded like she was being tortured. Her cries were literally echoing up my driveway. And just as I was about to step through the trees, I heard a car honking, and my mum's sudden voice asking me where I was going. She said she almost hit me because I'd ran out of the street out of nowhere. I was a bit rattled, mumbling something about how she got out and why she went in her car. She was confused about my confusion, and I never brought it up again. But occasionally this same situation will repeat. Not exactly, but my mother still cries out at me through the woods. I've explained it to my therapist, but she insists that I'm not actually losing it. Does anyone know what this can be or how to stop it? I recently got a puppy and he refuses to go to the end of our driveway and will sit midway and just stare into the forest. I grew up in the sticks in England, very rural place. The house in which I live on borders a forest. The area in which we live has been lived in for hundreds of years, but our land specifically where our house is built is called the Priory, the name of the house. You see, there used to be a large convent or priory located right here. I think it was either partially or completely destroyed during the reign of Henry VIII, and since then it was built, rebuilt, and eventually the land was sold off to whoever bought it and eventually fell into the hands of my family. It's been done up a number of times, but the land, the forest, and the house all have some spooky happenings. Something that's important to note is that years ago an archaeological team came to do some investigating, and they found that the supposed grounds on which this priory was built apparently went all the way into the forest. There were some outbuildings out there, not sure for what, but it was a rather large place. That area has now been consumed by forest, which is natural. I don't often go into the forest. It's a fairly creepy place. It's quite thick and dark, and there's one incident that'll always stick out with me. I didn't see anything, but I heard something that chilled me to the bone. You see, I had a friend who didn't live too far away, about a 10-minute walk through this forest. You can either brave the forest walk or take the roads, but the roads means it takes about a good half hour on foot, and me being lazy, of course opted for the far easier route. I go down on my bike as it's mostly downhill, and when coming back up I usually just walk with my bike because I'm lazy. One night I had been staying a little bit too late. It was about 2 a.m, and I suddenly regret the Xbox and alcohol binge as I slowly trudge my way back up in the dark. I have my torch, which I always bring with me in my bag, and start flashing it so that I can see my way. It's got a really high lumen count, so it really illuminates everything I need to see, not one of those tiny miniature things. This is proper heavy duty, one that my grandfather gave me. Anyway, as I'm about halfway through, making my way up the little dirt path, I hear something far away. It sounds like whispering or talking. I find it odd that there's anything happening at this time in this extremely rural patch of nowhere, as this has never happened before, and I suddenly sober up very quickly and feel scared. What the hell could be here? Why is it here to begin with? I think it might be best to turn my torch off if I get any closer or hear any more noises, but I carry on cautiously. With about 3 minutes to spare to the entrance of my house, out of nowhere the sound drops like a bomb. All of a sudden voices are around me and the voices erupt into chanting. I just about crap my pants and book it all the way back to my house. I left my bike stranded in the dirt path, too terrified and too scared to bring it with me. The sounds continued going until I was approaching the border of the forest, and once I left, almost like magic, the sounds ceased. I was too scared to shine my torch back in the forest, too afraid of what I would see. Only a few days later did it dawn on me that I might have been hearing the spirits of perhaps some of the original residents of the priory. But for that I can't be certain. I did go back and collect my bike, and for a few weeks decided to try and take the road instead, but ultimately just decided to not come back from my friend's house that late anymore. I never gave him the reason why. I didn't think he'd believe me, but it really unnerved me. I hope you guys believe me. When I was very young, I was living with my mum in a small town in central Texas. It wasn't exactly tiny, but the town still felt ramshackle, like it was left behind by the bigger cities and urban areas, including the surrounding county. Thick forest and farmland hemmed the town on pretty much every side, and we lived in an old house on the very edge of town. The road leading to it turned off from one of the main streets, then quickly turned from asphalt to gravel, and then gravel to just dirt. It was about 1/4 of a mile long, and our house was pretty much at the very end of it, with 2 larger properties on either side. There were lots of houses, mobile homes and RVs up and down the road, but our house was the closest to the road. It was perched on the edge of a very steep incline that led right down to a creek, and from there straight into the woods. The house was actually slightly slanted because of this. You could place a marble on the floor in any room and it would roll in the same direction every single time. It wasn't a great place to live, but it was the best my mother could afford at the time. I wasn't exactly the bravest kid, and the forest spooked me quite a bit. I didn't like being out there alone, but it was fun to explore when I was with friends, and I can never recall encountering anything weird. Sometimes when it got dark, we would stand on our back porch, which overhung the slopes, and we'd make noises trying to get coyotes to bark back at us. One day, kind of out of nowhere, my mother mentioned that she heard someone shouting in the woods the afternoon before. She had been standing in the kitchen with the back door open and heard what sounded like someone calling for help. I remember her saying she didn't do anything about it, because the voice sounded almost mocking, like it was making fun of someone, and she assumed it might have been some teenagers playing. A couple of days later, I had a similar experience. I was standing in the kitchen, the sun was going down, and I was washing the dishes. I had the kitchen windows open and I heard it clearly coming from down the slope in the forest. "Ah, help me," were the words as far as I can remember. They repeated once more and then stopped. I remember being very confused because they sounded exactly like how my mum had just described them. It was almost like someone was doing that breathing, speaking thing where they try and sound like they're shouting but actually aren't. The voice was rough and higher pitched, like a guy trying to sound like a girl, if that makes any sense. I told my mum and she was freaked out since we'd both heard pretty much the exact same thing. She's a very religious woman and insisted we pray to protect ourselves from whatever was going on. I wasn't, and still I'm not religious at all, but that was the last either of us heard anything like that. We lived for less than a year in that house. We didn't move because of the strange happenings, but rather because that summer we had a lot of heavy rain, and the slope the house was built on was actually collapsing, causing the house to tilt even more than before. That's my story. I was out in the garden with a friend when my partner Bob called our dog Spot. Just his name. Spot started running towards him when he heard his name, then stopped dead in his tracks. In the same amount of time it took for Spot to hear his name and run a few steps, I thought, Bob's calling Spot. I wonder why. Wait, was that Bob? The last thought was coming to me just as Spot stopped with one leg raised mid-step. My friend and I looked at each other, eyebrows raised. Did you just hear that? I asked. Yeah, it was Bob calling Spot, my friend replied, a bit dubious. You see, Bob was about 100 yards away last I knew, and his voice seemed to come from closer and to the right of where I was. Feeling something was off, I yelled, Bob, do you call Spot? He responded, What? From where I had thought he was, and because he's a bit hard of hearing. Trying to be heard, I yelled if he actually heard Spot, to which he replied, Spot? Thinking I was asking him to call the dog. Instantly, Spot takes off running to Bob. My friend and I look at each other with more eyebrows raised and agree that that was weird. 10 minutes later, when Bob joined us in the garden, I asked him if he called Spot. He said, Yeah, you told me to. I said, before I yelled to you. No, he said. He thought it was weird that I was asking him to call Spot, and I told him what happened, and he immediately guessed that it was a raven mimicking him calling our dog. At that point I was dubious, assuming a raven wouldn't exactly sound like him, or enough alike to fool myself, my friend, and Spot. Also, we've never heard that ravens talk before. Fast forward 3 weeks when I mentioned to my friend in a group of people how I've never been creeped out at our place before, but that I can't stop thinking about that, he says, Me too. Then suddenly, remembering, he turned to Bob and said, Earlier today when you walked up the hill, did you call for Nick, referring to his partner who was also visiting? No, I don't think I ever did, replied Bob. My friend then relates a similar story to the first, hearing Bob call for Nick, but not from where he thought Bob should be. Feeling doubtful, then going to find Nick to see if he heard it too, but he hadn't. This happened outside. We live in a fairly remote place in Northern California. National forests border 3 sides of our property, and we have neighbors to the north of us. None of the neighbors are close enough to hear, and they don't sound like Bob. I looked into corvids, as we have many, including ravens and Stella jays. The first one could be explained by this. Bob calls Spot often enough that it's not too far-fetched a corvid could be mimicking that. The second one is a bit harder for everyone involved to swallow. Bob hasn't said Nick's name very often on our property, mostly just in the last week that they've been visiting, and certainly not calling it. I also looked into cryptids. I was told once that the Native Americans believed in an entity that lived on the mountains that I now live on, but I wasn't told much about it, nor that it was good nor bad, but just that the natives were told to stay away from it. Any thoughts on what it could be? This happened a few years ago, in a campground in Florida. I visit this campground every 2 years, and I was very familiar with it at this point. This is the first time anything like this has happened. This campground is also in a national park, so there is a thick forest surrounding it. My cousin and I left a cabin and went on a walk down the road and through the woods at sunset. About a mile or so in, we go off the road into an area that I am familiar with. It has a roundabout type road with trimmed weeds in the middle. The roundabout has 2 roads in it, the one we entered from, and another that leads to an area I'm unfamiliar with. To the left of the roundabout was a large cabin my family frequently rented out for events. To the right was a picnic area gazebo that overlooked a pond. We were completely surrounded by dense wood. My cousin and I go to the gazebo to talk and watch the gorgeous sunset over the pond. We found the fuse box for the gazebo and turned it on for a little extra light while we spoke. After a while, darkness started to catch up with us, and we realized the area looked like a perfect spot for a horror film to take place. So we decided to turn the lights off and head back to the cabin. Being in the middle of a national park, there were no lights or poles or street lights. It was pitch black save for our phone flashlights. Once we turned off the gazebo, we noticed something that shouldn't be there. In the middle of the roundabout area was a green light/orb suspended about 5 feet in the air. It was about the size of a grapefruit but didn't move. There was nothing in the roundabout that would produce light, and the light didn't illuminate anything or look like it was attached to anything. My cousin and I are a little freaked out by this and made our way towards the road, avoiding the orbs as much as we can. A short ways down the road we realized we had no idea where we were and that we went down the wrong road. We returned to the roundabout area and the orb is still there. Unfortunately, the road we needed to go down was on the other side, meaning we would have to pass the light about 6 feet away to get to it. We try our best to walk by and with a closer look, but I still can't see the source of it. We eventually returned to the cabin and it was all good. That was my first and only time being in the area at night. I didn't take any photos because I was pretty scared of being in the pitch black woods in the middle of the night, and was using my phone's flashlight to make sure I didn't accidentally step on a snake. That last night I googled for any paranormal activity in that campground and only came up with random articles saying the devil appears in insert campground's name here type of stories. Nothing really explains the orb though. I asked my friend about it and he said it was probably an animal spirit, but it was very motionless, just suspended in the air, the glowing green light. Me and my friends were at a local park here in Brazil. We were playing around in a maze. It's a very small one and you can't get lost. Then suddenly we noticed that one of our friends called Marcello is missing. At first we thought he was pulling a prank, so we waited 5 minutes hoping he'd show up, but he didn't. Then we received a call from him. You could hear his voice, he was very scared, and I asked him where he was and he said, "I'm in the middle of the woods." Our reaction was like, "Why'd you go into the woods at night alone?" It's very important to note that Marcello is most easily the scariest member of the group, and he would never in his own mind simply walk alone into the woods, yet he did. So after that he said that he was following a small glowing rock, and this little rock led him into the forest. And we started walking towards the forest, and when we got close, we ordered him to scream as loudly as he could so we could hear him. Nothing. He wasn't close to us at all. We asked him what he could see around him, so we had an idea of where he could be. He said he was next to a football field, but that was roughly 300 meters away from the maze. We knew where that was, and we immediately began running there. When we arrived, we find him and he was scared out of his mind, shaking, and he said that someone with white pants was chasing him. So knowing that, we said to members of the group to stay with Marcello so that we can investigate who or what was chasing him. Me and my friend started threatening whoever was in the woods to show up. Then a flashlight is turned, and we look, and 3 guys, clearly nervous, who weren't wearing white pants, were standing there. We give them a warning that if they were the ones chasing our friend, we'd mess them up. We go back to the maze, and Marcello told the story of what happened to him. He said he saw some glowing stones on the ground and started following them. They led to a path in the middle of the woods and then vanished, and that's when he called us and noticed the shrine of Macumba, something like witchcraft. After we instructed him to scream, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned and saw someone with white pants coming his way. Then the footsteps started getting faster, and he started running. Then he said he was next to the football field, and we found him. After a while discussing this, we reached a point in the argument where we all agreed that the glowing rocks were very strange and inexplicable. We decided to check the woods out to see if we could get a glimpse of something weird. Then we see it. A small luminescent rock at the start of the path that led to the Macumba shrine. We were shocked. Marcello wasn't seeing things and he wasn't lying. They were right there in front of us. We started getting closer and closer at that point. I was ready to throw my hands at whatever the hell was lurking there when we heard a noise coming from inside the forest. We turned and saw nothing. Then we all heard at the same time the sound of chains hitting the ground, and we ran the hell away from there and decided that we'd had enough paranormal experiences for one night. My family owns a farmhouse in Ireland. It's an extremely rural area. The house experienced some paranormal activity in the past. The living room sits directly over a path people could take to the beach, to either church or coffee shops or something else. We believed these famine victims continued to walk through the house. The living room sits directly over a path people would take to the beach, to either church or coffin ships or something else. We believe that these famine victims continued to walk through the house. During the 1900s to 1920s, my great-great-grandmother heard a noise downstairs. She rushed down to see the impossible. The Sacred Heart lamp, which is literally screwed into the wall, was ripped out. The coal from the ashes of the fire had been thrown about the place and the room was trashed. Terrified, she rushed back upstairs and stayed there for the remainder of the night. In the morning, the room was untouched, perfect, as if it hadn't been trashed. The house experienced many more experiences over the coming months, possibly years. I come from a very Catholic family, so the house was blessed. The activity only ceased when a step was built. A small pathway winds to the house of the side. A step was put next to it so the spirits would take the path, not the house. My grandma always told me to never ever remove the stone. I would go on, but there's something scarier. Something happened that I'm quite scared about. There's a very dense and dark patch of forest, and whenever I'm going through it I am filled with dread. It makes me, quite frankly, want to wet myself. I never felt alone there. As soon as I smelt the wretched smell of rotten flesh, I'd hightail it out of there because I knew whatever it was close. Some evil, malicious thing. There was only one time that I saw this spectral abomination. It was translucent, I couldn't tell a gender, but it had this horrible sunken face. I couldn't see its eyes, they were so sunk. There was no light reflecting off it when it looked at me, and I've never been more scared in my life when we locked eyes. When I saw it, my stomach dropped, and I felt physically sick. I immediately shut the curtains and prayed and prayed and prayed. I did feel better afterwards, and when I had left the house the next morning, it looked like animal claws were right outside the door, marking it. I knew it had been real and not a dream. But to convince myself that there was something I could do, I went to the edge of the forest and prayed. I never go in there anymore. I know I shouldn't. There's something horrific in there, and I never want to lay eyes on it again. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's video. If of course you did, please don't forget to do the usual down below. And if you enjoyed Haunted Woods, maybe there'll be more soon. I am looking for poop stories. If anyone has had some embarrassing accidents or interesting experiences involving excrement, feel free to send them to me, as I'm going to have another horrifying and hilarious video installment of that coming soon. If you send me the stories. I hope you do. It's going to be really funny. So follow me on Twitter, and I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.